morning.
Good morning.
I'm going to talk about something a little different than what I planned on talking about. As you guys know, I'm into Christian apologetics, love it, and want to share that with you all. And usually that involves giving arguments and evidences for, say, God's existence. And what I really wanted to focus on is where we've been close to Easter Sunday, and as Anglicans in the Easter season, I wanted to give you some of the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. But I changed my mind. Because what I found is, when we know this, and we know stuff about the historical evidence, we get excited to share it with people. But what you'll run into are certain barriers to people even seeing Christianity as being evidentially shown. And that's what I want to talk about. So today I'm going to title this, 3 Barriers to Christian Truth. Because the world is just full, our culture is just infused with false beliefs and unchallenged assumptions. And what this does is it leads people to only consider Christianity as a matter of opinion, not as a matter of fact. So I'll repeat that. These barriers can cause people to see Christianity only true as a matter of opinion, not as a matter of fact. Which means evidence would matter. Right? Evidence would play a role. So a lot of times people aren't ready for the evidence yet. Now I picked 3 barriers I'm going to talk about because, these false assumptions, these unchallenged beliefs are just permeated through our culture, through the media. We even take them into our entertainment, where there's music, movies, especially the universities propagate these false beliefs. They're just unchallenged assumptions. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to challenge 3 of them. And these are 3 of the most common, at least in my experience, that you'll run into when you try to talk about Christianity as being a matter of fact. The first one is scientism. Not science, but scientism. The second is religious relativism. The third is blind faith. So again, 3 barriers are scientism, religious relativism, and blind faith. Now, scientism is the view that the hard sciences alone, such as, say, chemistry, biology, physics, astronomy, they alone provide the genuine, only knowledge of reality. That's scientism. Now, how many of you are familiar, you put your hand up, with the comedian Jim Gaffigan? He has a hilarious bit on Hot Pockets and stuff like that, just cracks you up. Well, he has a special called Noble Ape that's on. And he actually expresses scientism in a really genuine way. He actually holds to a form of scientism. He says in his special, he's talking about a hospital named Mount Sinai. And he says, I notice a lot of hospitals are named after saints or places in ancient Israel. He goes, which is not that reassuring when you think about it. He goes, hi, welcome to our hospital. We're all about science, which is why our building is named after a place where God talked to Moses out of a burning bush. Over here's our Casper the Ghost wing, right next to our astrology center. He says, do you like UFOs? We love those, because we're all about science. Now he says that in a comedic routine, but what he expressed is scientism, that science alone gives us knowledge about reality. So religious beliefs and things like that just don't even count as knowledge. They're just fictitious and made up. And what we'll see is that's definitely not the case. And this is important to really hit this head on, because he's really saying that religious claims are like akin to ghost stories and superstition. And J.P. Moreland, who's a fantastic Christian philosopher, J.P. Moreland says, if scientism puts Christianity outside of the plausibility structure. And what that is what people generally consider to be reasonable and rational in our culture. So scientism puts Christianity outside of the plausibility structure, which has led to a number of shifts in how our culture processes reality. In other words, believing in Christianity isn't, if scientism is true and held to, these people aren't ready for the evidence for Christianity, because all that stuff is nonsense and hokey, and it puts it outside their plausibility structure. It's not even plausibly true. So if you just start giving them evidence, this barrier's there and won't let it go through. So one can see right away that scientism puts religious and moral truths as invalid routes of knowledge and hence becomes a barrier. Because it's the only thing we can know about reality are the hard sciences. Now, think about this for a minute. This inevitably leads to the conclusion that secularism is true. Namely, a non-religious society, atheism, is true. That's the conclusion of this. But we need not worry about how to defeat scientism. We only need to worry about its influence in the culture, as it's easily defeated by itself. And here's what I mean. Scientism, ironically, isn't science at all. It's rather a philosophical claim about science. So scientism says, only what is testable by science can be true. Think about that for a minute. Can we test that claim scientifically? Of course not. So this is an example of what philosophers call a self-refuting statement, because it establishes a criterion for truth that it cannot itself meet. So it's self-defeating or self-refuting. Now, for further reading and study on this, I would highly recommend J.P. Moreland's book, just released last year, called Scientism and Secularism, Learning to Respond to a Dangerous Philosophy. It's easy to read, it's inexpensive, and it'll prepare you to handle and break down this barrier to Christian truth when you run into it in your evangelism. Now, the second barrier I want to talk about to Christian truth is religious relativism. I want to start by reading 3 quotes, and I want you to tell me which one you think doesn't seem to belong with the others. The first one. All major religious traditions carry basically the same message. That is love, compassion, and forgiveness. And the important thing is that they should be part of our daily lives. The Dalai Lama. 2. There are as many paths to God as there are people, says the Spiritual Science Research Foundation. 3. I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father except through me. Jesus of Nazareth, John 14:6. Now, which one of those doesn't seem to fit with the others? It's clear it is number 3, right? Well, the first 2 quotes represent what's known as religious relativism, namely that there's many paths to God. And this view is described as being an inclusivist view. In other words, you try to include everybody. Now, in our culture, we find that it's completely politically incorrect to oppose religious relativism. And if you do, you're looked at someone who's narrow-minded, bigoted, or even arrogant for thinking you have an exclusive way to God. How dare you claim you have found an exclusive way to God, I've heard someone say. Like this is just some outrageous claim that you're making. Now, the claim made by Jesus of Nazareth is what is known as an exclusivist claim. There is one way to God, exclusively. I want to share 2 reasons as to why we should reject religious relativism. Number 1, most religions, while having superficial commonalities, have deep, irreconcilable contradictions. And they can't possibly all be true. Islam and Christianity, for example, are both monotheistic. They have that in common. They believe there's one God. However, they differ radically in that the God of Islam loves only conditionally and Christianity unconditionally. Those 2 claims can't be reconciled. Either God loves conditionally or unconditionally. You can't reconcile that. So these differences are logically opposed to one another and just simply can't be reconciled. So holding to religious relativism implies holding to incompatible, logically opposed statements about God. It's no different than believing that, say, a married bachelor can exist. By definition, if you're one, you can't be the other. And that's how these claims about God are across all these different religions. Number 2, the second reason we should reject religious relativism is because religious relativism, like scientism, which we just looked at, is self-refuting. Most of the religious people on the planet are exclusivists, not inclusivists. Whether you're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, etc. Now, what makes one an exclusivist is what? Believing that your way is the only way. That makes you an exclusivist. To try and demonstrate that they are right, the religious relative has to argue what? That his or her way is exclusively true. No, you exclusivists are wrong. You have to be a relativist. So this is actually self-defeating, just like scientism. They set up this thing like they've got to include everybody, but they exclude exclusivists. So by very definition, it's exclusivist and defeats itself. So it's not even possibly true, like scientism. And that's why it's critical for us to all train in discerning truth claims. And this way we won't be deceived into holding things like scientism or religious relativism, because these are serious barriers to Christian truth. Now, for more training on this barrier of Christianity as true, I'd recommend a book by Greg Kokel and Francis Beckwith called Relativism, Feet Planted Firmly in Midair. And I love the title. It cracks me up every time I hear it. It, too, is very inexpensive and cheap. It's an easy read, and it'll have you more than equipped to deal not only with religious relativism, but even moral relativism, which I'm not going to cover this evening, but I will in the future. And this leads to our last barrier, and this one's really important to me. This is one you run into really often. And a lot of these barriers can be, mostly are found outside of the church. This is one that can come from within the church, and it's highly problematic. And that's the concept that faith is blind. And everybody's heard the Mark Twain quote, right? He says, faith is believing something that you know ain't so. And you hear that all the time. It just permeates our culture in movies and everything. You hear that about faith. But this would make faith and reason what? Foes and not friends. They'd be completely opposed to one another. That would mean faith and facts are like oil and water. They simply do not mix. But faith as a concept derived from the Hebrew and Aramaic Old Testament, as well as from the Greek concept derived in the New Testament, never means a blind leap or believing something in spite of evidence. Rather, those concepts from those languages translated as faith or belief, etc., are better understood in English by the concept of a reasoned trust. We only trust that something is true if we have good reasons to think so. We only trust in a person if we have good reasons to think they're trustworthy. The Bible doesn't ask us to do anything different in the case of the truth claims about Christianity regarding the resurrection of Jesus, because the whole thing hinges on that. And also, you should trust in Jesus and have good reasons to do so. The Bible never invites you to do everything. I taught the other day on wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. Why get all those? Why would the Bible be so adamant about getting those and doing everything you can when faith and facts are opposed to one another? Wouldn't that defeat your faith? And that's actually totally false and totally bogus. Faith is actually built on reason. You've got to have good reasons for thinking and believing that something is true or trusting in a person. So what happens here is these Greek and Hebrew concepts had a more limited semantic range. Now the English word faith can actually mean blind or leap of and things like that. But what we've got to be careful when we do this, when we study the biblical text, is not to take modern concepts that weren't available back then, or that was not a thought in anybody's mind, and shove them back into the text when we read it. So the English word, like I say, has taken on a wider semantic range, a wider range of meaning, and it can mean blind and all that. But when you read it, think in your head, I don't even use the word faith anymore when I'm evangelizing people and trying to talk to people. I use the word trust and make sure they know it's a reason to trust. Because that's the only sense that the Bible talks about faith, whether it's the Old or New Testaments. So that way we are dealing with facts. And evidence is a supported thing. Because this can be a huge barrier, especially in the church, to holding that Christianity is true as a matter of fact. And I do think strongly that this pseudo-definition of faith that permeates the culture has absolutely crippling effects on the church at large, as well as it prevents those who aren't Christians from taking it seriously, especially reasonable people who are seeking the truth. This is a huge barrier for them. This also wreaks havoc on evangelism, doctrine, growing in holiness, as well as apologetics to support all of those things and even more. So all those things I just mentioned and more are foundational to living the Christian life. This is why many do not take Christian evidence as seriously, nor do they think making a serious case for the truth of Christianity is important at all. This is extremely unbiblical, as the Scriptures constantly confirm that we're to seek wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And even 1 Peter 3:15, which I've read, which is sort of the theme of doing Christian apologetics, where we're instructed to give good reasons for the hope that's within us and to do it with gentleness and respect. Well, why would we be commanded to do that? It's blind faith and you don't need evidence and on and on and on. This is just so unbiblical. It's mind-numbing. So in closing, I'd like to encourage you to better be prepared to break down these barriers to Christian truth. That way, when in evangelistic context, rather than just rolling through a bunch of evidences for Christian truth once we learn them, we need to find out if these people hold to any of these three things we've discussed today, or any other barrier. There's more than three. And like I say, some may even hold all three. If so, I pray you'll be better equipped to prepare them to see Christianity as a matter of fact and not as a matter of opinion.